Welcome to another episode of the Spe Salvi Institute Podcast. I'm Robert Mixa.
And I'm Andrew Petiprin.
Well, today I'm so excited to talk with Andrew about one of his favorite, I think his favorite movie, My Dinner with Andre. It's my first time seeing the film. This is one of these films that I've grown up with hearing about because my parents, shortly after they got married, they went to go see this film. And it's one of those films my parents laugh about because my dad, I guess, slept through the entire film. But they went to go see it because Roger Ebert, Siskel and Ebert, famous show, they highly recommended this film. So it was one of these movies I never saw but always heard about. And I have to say, watching it this past week, it also has turned into one of my favorite films. So Andrew, tell us why do you love this film? And I know you included it in your Watch With Me series.
Yeah. Well, I did when we were both working at Word on Fire. I made a video series called Watch With Me, where I took a particular theme and then I applied the theme to a collection of movies. And one of them was I made a video about, I think it was basically just about talking, like
Yeah.
talking in general, and
Conversation
um,
like that.
conversation. Yeah, and My Dinner with Andre was kind of the centerpiece of that. And yeah, I mean, My Dinner with Andre. So, a couple things about that, just to get the ball rolling for our discussion. My Dinner with Andre was released in 1980. It's directed by Louis Malle, who is a great French director who kind of cut his teeth in the 1950s. Believe it or not, a little tidbit of information about Louis Malle is that he was a cameraman for Jacques Cousteau and made these like underwater movies with Jacques Cousteau for a while. And according to André Gregory, whom we'll be talking about a lot here shortly, Louis Malle, he suffered some kind of like ruptured eardrum or something. He had some kind of underwater accident and then decided he didn't want to do this underwater stuff anymore. So he started making other movies. He was vaguely associated with, I say vaguely, he was kind of peripherally associated with the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave, though he wasn't really of it in the same way that Jean-Luc Godard or François Truffaut or Eric Romer or those guys were. But he knew all those guys. He ended up coming to America and he made some movies in America. And towards the end of his career, he made a real masterpiece in 1987, which is called Au revoir les enfants, his great World War II film that's somewhat autobiographical. But in 1980, somewhat unexpectedly, he connected with André Gregory and Wallace Shawn, and he agreed to make this movie for them of their own script, which was based on all kinds of wild experiences that André Gregory himself had actually had in real life. And he had become somewhat well known in the theater world and in the New York intellectual world for telling these anecdotes to friends when he would see them at parties and stuff like that. And there's all kinds of wild stuff, as we'll discuss. And then there was Wallace Shawn, who really idolized André Gregory, and André Gregory kind of discovered him and put on some of his plays. And our listeners and viewers may know who Wallace Shawn is because he's the little guy who says "inconceivable."
Yeah.
Unfortunately I have a little bit of a lisp, so maybe I sound a little
The
bit like
Rob
Wallace
Reiner one.
Shawn. Yes, may he rest in peace. One of Rob Reiner's great films, The Princess Bride. Wallace Shawn is in that, along with many, many other things. So,
With another
anyway, so
Andre, but a giant.
Andre the Giant. That's right. Yes. So anyway, I babbled on almost enough about that, but I guess the last thing I'll say about My Dinner with Andre is it is like no other movie you've ever seen. It is mostly with bookended with something else, but mostly a conversation over dinner between two men, one of whom is going through just kind of a wild midlife crisis, and the other one is also in a bit of a crisis, but of a different sort. Um, to me, I fall asleep, thinking of your dad's dilemma there, Bobby. But I mean, I fall asleep in these big action movies, not old school action movies, but kind of these Marvel type things. I find them incredibly boring. But what I don't find boring is talking about interesting things. And so, to me, My Dinner with Andre is absolutely riveting, and every minute of it just keeps me on the edge of my seat. And the credits roll after an hour and 45 minutes, I wish there was more. So I watch it over and over again, and it never disappoints me. So so much to talk about. But I'm curious for you, Bobby, what were your impressions of watching this for the first time?
Yeah, well, I did see little like clips here and there, mainly that main one we used to talk about a lot about kind of the concentration camp of modern society and building our own kind of prison in which we're the guards and we're also the inmates. And so I'm a little bit familiar with some of the themes that it's about, but watching it just sitting through the entire film, which by the way, it's actually up on YouTube, the whole film, so anybody can go watch that. The film is I felt like if you have to have like film as a medium that expresses reality, because the film for me was kind of all about contact with reality. I kept thinking about this as in some ways being the closest thing to a real conversation. And I felt like since reality is kind of the theme of the film, there's no like coincidence that it's just this long dialogue. And I was thinking throughout too that like Plato, because it kind of reminded me of a little bit of a Socratic dialogue because like in high school when I started reading Plato's dialogues, there, I was always asking, well, why in the dialogue form, this back and forth? It doesn't seem like kind of straightforward philosophy. And I remember we had our previous guest was DC Schindler. He wrote a whole book on why it's not accidental that it's in dialogue form. Because as you read the Phaedrus, I mean, the problem is writing and this kind of being in some ways separated with the technology, separated from the reality. It's like that electric blanket, which while Stephen Shawn loves so much, that separates him from connecting with reality. And I felt like it was so well done. And there's certain moments in the film when Andre Gregory either comes to kind of like you always almost feel like it's a QED, therefore, or a conclusion. And then the waiter comes up and either delivers the coffee and the amaretto or something else happens. And I just felt like it was perfectly done. And then the music, how it begins, like, I mean, you mentioned this, Andrew, about kind of the inner monologue of Wally and kind of in some ways having to have then a dialogue to get outside of himself to draw. And it says he likes to ask questions and he doesn't
Hmm.
want to really, it's almost like he wants to interrogate, but he gets so involved in this story and reacts to it that by the very end, with the kind of like serene music, and then this kind of like transformation that takes place in the character, seeing the whole world in a new light, that it's in
Hmm.
some ways what Andre Gregory talks about, like going on this whole journey that they say, well, why do you have to go off on this journey to Mount Everest? And it's almost like it's like a spiritual exercise for Wally. And he makes contact with reality, and then finally tells Debbie about my dinner with Andre, and that's how the film
Yeah.
ends. And I thought it was, in a way, a perfect film.
Yeah. I think it is I think it is a perfect film. Um, and let's back up and kind of think about where it comes from because it really comes from somewhere different than so much cinema. You know, so Andre Gregory, the real Andre Gregory, and both Andre and Wally are very clear in their real lives, like in subsequent interviews, that they really were playing characters. Like, so this is important to remember that if you're watching something on the stage or on a screen, I mean, this is something I remember. I've said this to you before, but this is something I remember I used to talk about with my father, my late father, a lot about he loved movies and he was a very sophisticated viewer of movies, with one exception. When he watched historical dramas, he would get very annoyed when things did not align with what he understood to be the real character or the real historical figure, you know? And I always would say to him, look, I understand why you feel that way, but it's still a movie. It's still a character, no matter what, even if it's trying to present something real, right?
Yeah.
So, but Andre Gregory, the real life Andre Gregory, was a big kind of avant-garde theater man. He produced these really interesting plays. He was highly acclaimed, and then in the mid 1970s, he burned out. He came to believe that he was a failure, and that the artistic medium that he had devoted his life to was meaningless. And the reason why was that nobody cared anymore. Like basically, if the idea is we're trying to, in a sense, put people in contact with the real. Um, One, is that ever really possible? And two, for all that we're striving to do this, people would rather just sit at home and watch professional wrestling or, whatever, right? Like something else. Wally, on the other hand, um, he is a playwright, but he is somebody who, you mentioned kind of the beginning and the end and how we're perceiving Andre through the lens of Wally. Like, you know, we're kind of sitting in his seat at the table in a way. And many viewers of the film might have his same prejudices, his same assumptions, all of those kinds of things. But a really interesting piece of information is that Wally did not want to have dinner with Andre. And it's precisely because he's heard tell that Andre has had these wild stories.
Mhm.
And once you get to the end of the movie, you realize that so much of Wally's life is governed by fear. That he himself articulates this, even though he seems to have come from a good family in New York, he's just trying to get by.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the movie, he
Yeah.
says, "When I was a little kid, I used to ride around in taxi cabs and go to museums, and everything was art and music and poetry. And now I'm 36 years old, and all I think about is money."
Yeah.
Right? And he articulates the same thing to Andre throughout the course of their conversation. And at the same time, he's a playwright. He's trying to create something that has, in some respect, the same end in mind as what Andre was doing. And one of their main points of contact, one of their major points of agreement throughout the film is their lament about the state of the theater, that it doesn't deliver the encounter with reality that they got into the business to do,
Yeah.
right? Um,
All the
so maybe,
superficial films being made, not films, sorry, plays that are being
yeah.
these days. And yeah, sorry to cut you off.
No, no, no. I was going to throw it back to you and say, well, maybe that's a good place to start because Andre's narrative, and you were right to say, like, Wally doesn't know what to do, and so he doesn't know how to engage in this conversation, right? So he decides, okay, I find it quite relaxing actually to ask people questions, so I'm just going to ask Andre questions. Now, an interesting thing that comes out right at the beginning is Andre mentions another friend of theirs who seems to have had a similar dinner with Andre at some point. And Andre makes the point of saying, he asked a lot of questions. He asked a lot of just kind of, friendly questions. Almost like as a kind of like wink to Wally, like, I know what you're doing. Like you don't know how to engage with me, right? Um, but nonetheless, he keeps asking and he keeps asking, and the conversation progresses to a point where I know I'm getting ahead of myself because it all ties together, but to a point where it's not accidental in my mind that Andre Gregory eventually mentions Martin Buber, because there really is a kind of I thou encounter that happens here where the two men at various points, and you're right, it's only briefly because it gets broken by the waiter coming over or a laugh or somebody goes off in a different direction with the conversation. But there are these moments when you think there's something more happening here than just small talk, than just information being exchanged, where there's a real encounter happening between these two men.
And yeah, at that moment too, it's Andre then who asked the question, like, well, why do you take that as a relevant sign?
Right.
I mean, we'll get
Right.
into the discussion of this, but it's as if, the whole time Wally is trying to be removed, but the story just draws him in, and his reaction to Andre, which is like a very honest. I mean, he doesn't. It's almost like he drops the mask because they're talking about the theater and how it's the theater. At the point when they say, "Oh well," Grotowski says, who's the famous, you know, um, theater director in Krakow, who Andre Gregory goes out to go into the Polish forest with for his beehives. But
Mhm.
it's like it's all since we're so good today at acting, we're all on a stage. There's no need for actually the theater anymore.
Right.
Because
Right.
we're all just actors, and I mean, we talk about this. I don't know how we should go about this because there's just so many. The movie is prophetic, And the
Yeah.
movie even gets into prophecy, which is like how can we even talk about something like prophecy, signs and omens, because that will just shatter almost our entire like imminent worldview that we have, and Wally in a way represents that worldview that now has kind of jutted up against what Andre is poking holes in. So
Hmm.
anyways, I going on Martin Buber, he does mention, because he doesn't mention explicitly I thou, but
Hmm.
the tales of Hasidism, which he then mentions how prayer is actually like a liberation, because there's these like spirits that it almost kind of sounds like Scientology a little bit, but I guess I don't know much about the Hasidic belief system, but there's like these spirits attached to you, and then the prayer is kind of what liberates you from these
Hmm.
spirits. But yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place, but I never thought I would find a movie which mentions Martin Buber, Heidegger, Albert Speer, The Little Prince,
Hmm.
and so many other things, and it actually
Yeah.
doesn't come off as pretentious in any way.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to get into. I think prophetic is the right word for this. Let's start there. And then I want to go back and sort of talk about this like question of the theater and the stuff in the Polish forest and the Little Prince and all that stuff too. But maybe that's the place to start because ultimately it's going to get into a pretty deep conversation about technology and about kind of the general idea of like the diversion. And this is, this was the fundamental problem that Pascal was worried about in the 17th century. I mean, this is like not a new problem. But in the modern age, it is such a bigger problem, so much more intense a problem. And it's really telling that, I think anyway, that Andre's crisis comes about, and he even makes this point about how he believes that the 1960s were kind of the end of humanity.
Mm.
And this is a point that now people are writing about. I mean, people like Ross Douthat, even like kind of on the conservative side, but I think people on the progressive side are too, like basically saying, look, like at the end of the 60s, there was this common sense of almost like a kind of sigh of despair
Mm.
that it was like we all ran out of things to think about. It's like we went to the moon, okay? And what did all that technology give us?
Yeah.
A computer that we keep in our pocket. That's what it gave us, right? Not, I mean, what else? I mean, I guess we could say, right, like other things, but ultimately, in a sense, like the next frontier after that is, oh, let's make the computer smaller. Let's make it, all these different things like this, right?
Yeah, instead of going
So,
on acid trips, which could be maybe closer to a spiritual experience, we'll just do that through, I don't know, some virtual reality. But it seems like the acid trip hippie thing is actually more authentic, where you have even people like Ernst Jünger.
right.
I mean, this is the whole like kind of dilemma, and what he saw back then as well is like
Mhm.
this if you want to say escape in the digital realm is the end of humanity.
Right. I mean, there's a part where it's kind of gruesome, but there's a part when Andre says something like, I can imagine a time sometime in the future where people will cut off their genitals just so they can feel something.
Yeah.
And whoa, that's
Pay ten
certainly a
thousand
little.
dollars to be castrated. Yeah. Uh,
Right. I mean, that's talk about prophetic, right? I mean, I do think that there's something to that, and there's something to drug use, and there's something to, all these kinds of things with this idea that there has to be something more. Like
yeah.
there has to be something else. And so maybe that's a place to start to come back to the theater question. Because okay, so Andre has tried this, he has believed in the theater as this sort of intriguing, this sort of unique art form where it's written but also performed, but it's in front of people, but it's with people. It doesn't have the kind of mediation of a camera lens. It doesn't have the mediation of running it through a printing press and then selling it in a shop. I mean, it is about the writing and the encounter with the human kind of all happening in the same place. I mean, I myself believe the theater really is just just the greatest in key ways. But he has this sort of devastating feeling that that all in his lifetime, in his own professional lifetime, goes away. And, maybe he's right about that. Maybe he's wrong about that or whatever. But then what does he do? He's a man of means where we find out he has money somewhere. So what does he start doing? But trying to find a way to be the man of the arts, the man who's like experiencing and giving others the experience of reality through art in some like deeper way. So he goes to the Polish forest, he goes to Tibet, he goes to the Sahara Desert. He has this like really frightening sounding, like sort of near, almost like, I don't even know how you describe it, like sort of like pretend near death experience in Montauk on Long Island, right? Where he's just like trying to find it. Where is the encounter with the real? So I don't know. I'll throw that back to you because I'm sure there's probably all kinds of different ways we could go from there. But I just wonder what you thought about like that sense of like it's not full-blown despair, but like you can see that underneath. Like he's like trying to find it,
Yeah.
and where is that going to lead him? I don't know.
Well, I mean, the interesting Findhorn, he mentions another place that he hears about Findhorn in these communities that in a way are like an oases of hope because of where the society, the technological society is going. And that eventually, he kind of doesn't completely seem to fall into despair. But it is kind of through these little, like almost he compares them to like monasteries, that people are in a way cultivating the underground, and just as in the mid, I mean, maybe the history is a little controversial, but in the Middle Ages, you have all these kind of spiritualist, the spiritualist underground, and maybe these communities will be like the underground today. And I don't blame him. I mean, so man, heck, if you have to go out to the Polish forest to try to find something like that, please give me a call and maybe we can find some I don't know Jerzy Grotowski, but there is Michał Łuczewski who is doing something similar. I mean, it's funny, when I was hearing about Jerzy Grotowski and all of these kind of experimental things and pl almost like they're just playing. I mean, it's play acting and it's funny because I did a couple of these workshops with this. We did a podcast with Michał Łuczewski,
Yeah,
sociologist,
yeah.
University of Warsaw, and I remember I did these two times, couple of days, complete strangers, and we had something like a beehive. And the first one was on Wawel Hill, right there in like the in the palace. And I remember a bunch of people, especially from the West, because you'd have these like almost this kind of these seemingly childish play acting sessions where you'd like complete grown-ups being asked to take their shoes off and walk around the room and feel the floor, or to be guided by somebody else when you're blindfolded, and then say to act these things like almost acting the progression of history out, and even putting on like face paint and coming up with tribal songs. And so I was thinking of Michal the whole time with Grotevsky, but there's this kind of like getting outside of the kind of like habitual, if you want to say what André says is like the mechanical way of being, and then really,
Hmm.
really living. So it seemed like at the heart of the film, not just with contact with reality, but finding that life source again, to combat the kind of dead world that we're in, was really at the heart of the film. And going back to the Polish stuff, Jerzy Grotowski, I mean, this is a real guy. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
so, and his whole experimental theater in Krakow, theater is really still important. I mean, every
Hmm.
single block there's a different theater. I mean, I'm always wondering, like, how can these things, like, I mean, how do these things like financially, survive? And there's a
Hmm.
bunch of people who come to Krakow and study, and theater is the thing. And there's a bunch of like actors who they don't go in. I mean, cinema is its own thing here, and I don't think it's very good right now in Poland, but it's the theater is still really alive. That's why I wish I kind of that's why I wish I spoke Polish so I could go to um,
Hmm.
these theaters. But yeah, I mean, so anyways, yeah, it's Andre's journey. spiritual journey, it seemed that that yeah, I mean it's kind of nerve-wracking because in contrast to Wally's, like you mentioned fear and almost kind of protected shell that he's built around himself.
Hmm.
He never lets anything in. But
Right.
with Andre, you have this kind of like Charles Taylor talks about the porous self versus the kind of the porous self versus the buffered self. And if
Yeah.
you want to talk about different ages, it's like maybe the best way of talking, but the porous self lets the kind of supernatural, transcendent, mystical in a way, you do have a relation at the heart of things. Whereas the buffered self, yeah, you are totally disconnected. That seemed to be like for me what was going on. Um,
Yeah.
and, also this desire for the sacramental. When he goes into the forest, they have this christening and they baptize him. And okay, it's not some laugh because I mean, it's not a real baptism. They give him a new name, but
Hmm.
this kind of portal into a new world that they send him on
Hmm.
is so interesting. And also the poles still kind of have this sense too that like there is something like a like you're in this porous world of spirits because he talks about his flag that he has, and he puts a what is it, Tibetan swastika? Is that
Uh-huh.
right on the flag? And all these horrible things, like his wife is vomiting and she turns pale white and vomits. All these horrible things happen with this flag. And then finally he gets the Polish woman who calls him up and says she gets the flag, and then they finally have this like they burn the flag because there's
Hmm.
something almost like demonic about the flag itself. So
Mm.
it's like it's in contrast to what Wally is saying is like everything is just the same. It's like, it's all just the same. We're for Andre, there's like these particular things that are in some ways supercharged, that make them different. And like just to kind of finish this up, like Wally's like, well, why do you need to take them to Mount Everest? Why do you need to take them out into the Sahara to experience the world? Like, okay, and he's got a point. I mean, everything is like, why not here? Why not just a cigar shop right next door? And he's
Hmm.
right. He's right.
Yes.
But like at the same time, it does require, the sacred and the profane, the separation to then fully appreciate the profane. You always hear about like how they separate the temple from the rest. Why isn't, the whole of the cosmos just one big temple, right? Okay, but in
Yeah.
this separate space. But I think Andre is correct. Like, no, in order to recognize what Wally is even trying to say, you do need to today kind of almost take you out. And anyways,
Right, right, because we can't see. And this is
yeah,
kind of where I wanted to go next. Like
yeah,
and look, I mean, this is in Plato too. I mean, this is and we've talked about this with
yeah,
regard to Ratzinger, right? I mean, the idea of like that art wakes you up. It teaches you to see,
yeah,
right? And so that is the thing. Like if you go to a Bertolt Brecht play or Grotowski or whatever, like one of these, whoever the people are that they really admire, right? Like then that should then, when you come out from the play, it should allow you to see things in the cigar store that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. We might say as Catholics, like that is what the Mass should do for us on some level, right? Um, but we'll leave that aside for a second. But unless you want to say something about
but
that.
on the seeing thing, maybe you could say something about this because Andre just keeps saying things like, even the doctor who looked at his mother who's dying. I mean,
Right.
is so happy because it's her arm, but he only saw the arm, right? That's doing well. And all of these, like the woman who only ate chicken and then she died because, she only ate chicken. But like our incapacity to see today,
Yeah.
like another element.
Well, and this is what Andre repeatedly refers to as the dream world. He says, like, yeah, we just see, we're not really seeing. we're seeing things according to kind of the unreality that we already inhabit. Like a doctor who specializes in broken arms, who goes into a room with a woman who has every single thing wrong with her, um, is only looking at the progress of her arm. And if he feels like she's made progress, then his assessment of the situation that he's walked into is a success. This is wonderful, when in fact it's nothing of the kind, right? Wally raises the point about how we're so inept at really seeing that extends even to kind of understanding and relating that we say these strange things to each other that we have no intent behind them to mean anything negative. And yet that's precisely the effect that's achieved. Like we think we need to say something. So he raises the point about how he had to wear a cat head in a production of The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. And he was the cat, and he had to wear a cat head, but he hadn't been able to rehearse with the cat head until the night of the show. And so the cat head arrives, and his fellow actors say to him something like, well, that when you put the cat head on, all of your timing will be off. You won't be able to hear, everything will be different. And he said, like, but he's about to go on stage. Like, why would you say something like that to me? Something that clearly could only make my situation worse. And yet, Bobby, like, hasn't that happened to you? Like stuff like that, exactly like that has happened to me. And I'm sure I've done it to other people too, because we're all weird. We're all just in the dream world rather than like really seeing a situation, right?
I had this happen 2 days ago, and I could not stop thinking about it. Like, why would you make that comment in front of my whole class? It could have only been to take me down in some way, and I just kept thinking about it. I'm like, well, was it really intended though that way?
Right.
It had to be. Anyways, but yeah,
Right.
I mean, it's interesting too, like how, they mention in like he talks about particularly maybe in the West how something totally like a tragedy would occur, and yet we just will kind of laugh and joke and
Because we're totally uncomfortable with reality, right?
exactly.
I mean, if a loved one of yours dies, I've witnessed this. Like people don't know what to say. Like I mean, and maybe the most mature among them will just say, I'm really sorry," or whatever, and they know like that's because what can you say, right? But more often than not, it ends up being something totally strange. Like somebody will make a joke about it or and it's just like the disconnect is so weird. It's like the reality. But we do this to ourselves too. Like we might be going through something horrible, and this comes up in the movie a little bit. We might be going through something, and you see somebody on the street or you see somebody and they ask you, "How are you?" And you go, "I'm good. Yeah, things are good." Because we just stay in the dream world. It's too painful. There's just too many unknowns to come out of it.
Made me think of that scene, which what Woody Allen movie is it? Is it Annie Hall when he's a little boy and they go to the doctor and he's like, well, he's not doing his homework, and well, because the universe is expanding and soon enough
Mhm.
Brooklyn will expand and there will be no Brooklyn, okay? And what
Mhm.
does that Brooklyn have to do with the universe? Or anyways, what's the line? And then the doctor says, well, that won't be happening for a long time now, will it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he just kind of giggles,
Yeah.
laughs, and
Right. The doctor is basically saying, just come back to the dream world, man. It's too painful out and just don't think about real stuff. Don't. Like, and maybe that's a good point. I wanted to kind of mark there is an interesting transition in the movie that I think there are a couple of interesting transitions, but
yeah.
there's whole long part at the beginning where they're talking about it starts with the theater, right? Then it moves quickly towards this very significant experience that André has had in the Polish forest with Grotowski and the beehive and all this stuff, right? Then it goes on to his talking about this sort of kind of what he believes to be this providential encounter with the Little Prince and Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and all that stuff. Um, there's the flag, there's Tibet, there's Findhorn, then there's finally the Montauk event. And we're running through all this kind of stuff. Please, listeners and viewers, please go and watch this because there's no point in our rehearsing, everything that happens in this movie. But please go and watch it because we really believe it will change your life if you haven't seen it. Um, but anyway, we'll move on in our own discussion too. Okay, then there's the Montauk event. where he's buried on All Hallows Eve, and it's very terrifying. And he describes this. He says this was the last big event, the end. That's what he says, right? I tend to think I noticed this time around that there's this interesting bookend here where it starts with the forest in Poland where he has this kind of baptism, and then it ends with the event on Montauk where he's buried,
Mm.
and where in some respect he comes back to life, where there's a kind of resurrection, right? So he's explaining this quest he's been on as a baptism, all kinds of difficult, chaotic stuff, including, by the way, seeing a creature at mass, which is an interesting little detail. Um, and then being buried and resurrected. You want to jump in? Go ahead on
No,
this
no, no,
part.
no. Go on.
Okay.
Continue.
Yeah. So, okay. So all that stuff happens. Then you get the sense like, wow, okay, where's it going to go from here? And this is when he transitions and he has this like expression of, I think, pretty sincere humility. But I think it like everything else kind of goes really dark really fast, right? Because it's like he has this baptism, death, and resurrection, and he comes into this deep sense of understanding his own mortality and that the world is so much bigger than him. Um, but where does he go? He compares himself to Albert Speer. He basically says, "I'm no better than a Nazi. Everything I've been doing in my life is horrible, and there's nothing in between. Like, what is any of this for? You know?" Um, and then he sort of goes on to getting into more of this dream world stuff and whatever. But what did you think about that? His comparing himself to Albert Speer and kind of the Nazi thing.
Yeah, cultured man, right? Who doesn't think that, he is in some ways has to face the same consequences that everybody else. He's kind of in some ways above the fray. I thought that was quite interesting, but also Wally's laugh at that comparison to Nazi, I think is quite shocking. But then, yes, it's interesting that from there, he goes into that kind of, if you want to say, critique of modern life and dehumanization. And that's really, there's certain points at which he transitions. Instead of just telling his nice story, he gets into this really kind of like almost like a conviction, almost prophet-like with Wally. And that's when I feel like it really, the kind of the real dialogue begins. I mean, if you guys are interested, like, I don't want to say skip all of the stuff about his crisis awakening and his journeys, but by that point in the film, that's when it really, you have these kind of like two, if you want to say, two cultures clashing at that moment. And
Mhm.
you have like this kind of pragmatic humanism of Wally, and then contrasted with this thing that Andre's discovering.
Yeah, I think that Louis Malle really paced this movie very well. And there was a lot, by the way, I've watched some interviews with Wallace Shawn, who
Yeah.
is kind of the lead writer. I mean, all of this is kind of Andre Gregory's stuff, but Wallace Shawn was really the one who kind of felt like he was the main writer of the film, although both of them are given the writing credit. But there was a lot, like Louis Malle, I think clearly had a vision for the way to construct the narrative and pace it. And there were things that had to be cut and all of that sort of thing. But when you pay close attention, the first 45 minutes of the film, at the 45-minute mark is where it sort of ends Andre's story about his journey that culminates in the event at Montauk, right? Then there's about a 15-minute period there from the 45-minute to an hour mark. And that includes all the stuff about Wally talking about the cat suit head and how inappropriate people are in their interpersonal relationships and all that kind of thing. Then it's when you get to about the hour mark that's when that's where the movie goes really much more in this sort of prophetic direction about, we could even say, like, on some level, like where Andre has resolved that this all the answer has to be in this stuff somewhere, in this sort of understanding the signs of the times kind of thing, you
Mhm.
know. And this is where eventually, I think it's about the hour and 5 minute mark, we get into the whole discussion about the electric blanket. And maybe that's a place to kind of pivot from here. But I don't know if there's anything you want to pick up from all that stuff that I just said, but I'd love to kind of talk about the electric blanket as a jumping off point to some of this other stuff too.
Yeah, the electric blanket that Debbie and Wally receive, and but in a way, for Andre's reaction to that is he would never use the electric blanket, not only because he doesn't trust technology, but it in a way separates you, and he would rather have actually have to kind of snuggle up to another, and I think relate is the kind of key word that he likes, but the electric blanket kind of, yeah, it in ways detaches you from the world, the cold New York that you're living in. But then uh, Wally says, "Well, I don't want to get rid of my electric blanket. I'm quite comfortable, and life is hard. I mean, like, life is hard. New York is cold. Barely getting by. I'm lucky if I appreciate these little things like the cold coffee that I have waiting. And if there's not a cockroach in the cold coffee as I wake up, then great." And I can just have enough, maybe inspiration to write another play here or there and just be with I believe it's Debbie. Yeah, be
Yeah,
with
Debbie. Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah. And like interesting things there. Like on the one hand, like, so he's still trying to be a playwright,
Yeah.
but he's never had the delusions of grandeur that Andre has, right? So he's happy to just like have his electric blanket, sit around and read Charlton Heston's autobiography, have a childless existence with his girlfriend whom he seems to love a lot. And, maybe every once in a while sit down and try and write a little something and see what comes of it and that kind of thing. Um, which is, it's interesting to watch Andre's reaction to that. I mean, it's like I don't know, because it's like clearly Wally well, let me back up and say we've had
Well, if you
conversations.
look actually how it's filmed, they do because I think in the beginning part you just see Wally's face, but when it's actually that part, Wally, and you see Wally, you see Andre Gregory's face in the mirror, so you see his reaction. Uh,
Yeah, that's really well shot. And
yeah.
that's well, yeah, that's astute that you recognize that. That's right. Yeah. But like the part about the electric blanket is interesting because this reminded me of like conversations we've had on this podcast with Michael Hanby and with others. Like anytime you critique technology, any aspect of technology, you will often find that not maybe not often, but it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that if you critique some aspect of technology, that the person you're talking to will agree with you on some level. They'll say, "Yes, I do see what you mean about the dehumanizing effect." But they'll say, "But what do you want to do about it, man? I mean, really, like, sorry, but I'm grateful that dentistry is what it is. I'm grateful that my toilet flushes. I'm grateful for these things, and I do also understand how they make me a little bit less human than my ancestors were."
Well, Wally
And
says, I understand what you're saying, but I don't
mhm,
really understand what you're saying.
yeah.
And yeah, it's you go on though. It's
Well, I mean, because and Wally has a point, right? Because I mean, for all that Andre is so definitive about his feelings about an electric blanket, is he that definitive about having a radiator that radiates heat? Is he that definitive about? I mean, right? So, and that's always something that we face about anybody who's like at all critical of technology. But I do think probably the best version of Andre's argument, and I'm not saying he exactly mounts it here, but he more or less does in different places throughout the conversation, is to say, okay, fine. If you want to have the electric blanket, fine. I realize, I have heat too, and I have a flushing toilet or whatever. But what I am saying is you have to at least experience the lack of it sometimes, or you have to do something to awaken you to what effect that has on you, at least from time to time, right? I think that there's something like what he would be saying there. And I think then building on that, he'd say best case scenario, there are people out in the world who live as a kind of indictment of all of this dehumanizing stuff, that even if not all of us are able to live that way, the fact that they're out there is very beneficial to humanity. Whether those be monks who live, whether those be the Findhorn community, whether those be, whatever it may be. Um, and this is something that I think most people appreciate on some level without necessarily really fully embracing what Andre is saying. But I do fear that it's something that is um, I don't know, just kind of like less and less appreciated by a culture just so incredibly dominated by endless diversions.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you have to go to a monastery to kind of then, for a little bit, to step back into, let's just call it the world, to then see, wait a minute, this is quite abnormal what we're in. It's like going back to the make a little bit like the thing that Wally's so uncomfortable with is the suggestion that he just be with Debbie.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and he's like, well, does this like make you nervous? And he's critiquing, well, what do I do? Like I just relate? Are we just like relating? And
Right. We're going to do something,
yeah.
what? Yeah.
And Andre is like, well, but like in Tibet, like they don't feel some need to fill the world in with like he talks while he talks about purposefulness. It's like the
Goals. Right.
yes,
Yeah.
goals, yeah, which he critiques, right, in some ways. But at the same time, he can't get him, it makes him nervous to go outside of that. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah,
so
I mean, this is like people, if you've ever been on retreat in a monastery or something like that, I've done it a couple of times, and there is something incredibly liberating about being forbidden to talk at a meal or something, right? Like you feel like all of the unreality that I would feel like I would need to interject into this situation is now forbidden. And so all that exists is me and the plate of food, and I'm doing it with people. So it is communal in some way. Maybe somebody's reading from a book and I can listen to that or whatever. Um, but then the goal would be hopefully when you have an experience of something like that, then when you're having dinner with Andre next time at a fancy restaurant, that even though you are talking, you're understanding that the possibility exists of an encounter with another human being that isn't just rooted in talking about unreality in the chit chat or whatever, right?
well, just to tell you a story, I mean, like we talked about Michał Łuczewski is kind of like a Jerzy Grotowski of our times, maybe. But Michał told me this story after he showed this clip of John Paul II. John Paul II, he showed this clip of John Paul II in New York City when he was with a bunch of well, I don't know if it was high school students or primary students, but John Paul II goes into this huge like gym. This is like early on, I think in the early 80s. And John Paul II just sits there and doesn't say anything. He's got this script in front of him. I can't find the video, but he's got this whole script that he's supposed to read. They gave him this thing to read. And John Paul II is just quiet. He's just silent, looking at them, making eye contact, smiling, and the kids start responding to him. And he starts making these noises, like ooh. It's really like I've never
Oh,
seen this
wow.
thing before, but it's like and then he starts making these like little like more and more noises. And he knows in some ways how to create this, if you want to say, this relation with the kids. But around him you could see all these, like all the bishops are like freaking out, looking around like what the heck is going on. But the kids completely get him because there's this
Right.
playfulness to him, but he's completely shattering all the expectations that when you go at like a table and you're going to have that chit chat and, the awkward silence is just going to completely throw everybody off. Um,
Yeah, there's a part, by the way, just let me interject. There's a part where Andre talks about how, there was a scene at the Academy Awards where a man ran naked across the stage, or the Indian lady came up and accepted the award for Marlon Brando or whatever it was. And he says, like, those things are so shocking because they never happen. These moments where things just go haywire and you're like, it makes you feel nauseous or something. It's like, the normal kind of thing isn't happening. Like, and yeah, when the Pope steps onto a stage to give a speech and he starts making noises at children, the only reaction is like, oh my gosh, how do I process this? This isn't supposed to happen, right? It's
Yeah.
like, but at the same time, it's really wonderful. It's such a great reminder of something deeper.
Yeah, but Michał Wojciechowski kind of told me later, I guess in Warsaw, this John Paul II center, he was running a meeting. I hope he's okay with me saying this, but I guess he was running this meeting in which he just sat there and looked at everyone, and they're in complete silence. And he was trying to kind of just feel the room. Like you can kind of, you know what I mean? Like we all sense things like, okay, what's going on? Like any meeting and you have to get through everything. But like what's really going on is probably like the dynamic. Like we're not like looking at the actual reality here. There's so
Right.
much tension in this room. We need to go into the Polish forest and have some play acting and eat jam, cheese, and you know what I mean, whatever Grotowski was doing. But I guess somebody was so uncomfortable with the silence in the meeting that they reported it to, and this was like something that I guess got him in tons of trouble because of just being silent, not playing according to whatever it is. And it made me think, in so many ways, we come into these careers, and the movie is often too about the career and these roles we're supposed to play, and we have
Hmm.
to act a certain part, or like we're also at these, they talk about being at these parties, and we have to, like, in a way justify our existence, otherwise people won't even talk to us. I mean, I was thinking back a number of years ago, I'd go to some of these things. I remember going to Notre Dame a couple of times, and people heard me that, oh, this is Bobby Mixa and he works for Word on Fire. And they think I'm like, then all of a sudden they realize I'm kind of really not much. I mean, I'm really not the person to be talking to there. And you
Yeah.
see the total, like, they're not interested. They're looking for a way out of the conversation as quickly as possible because
I know.
I'm not like in a way, another, like, I'm not another means to their, career ascent or to get possibly closer to the big guy himself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
anyways, then I thought, oh, well, how many times do I do this as well? And you
Yeah.
start to realize that, we don't really look at the reality of the person in front of us, but the role they're supposed to play. And if
Right.
we don't have that status, we're just not interested, we don't attend. And then also too, like once we have these certain roles, we have to try to make ourselves all look like successes all the time. And what I loved about this was I was listening to Andre Gregory, like why he suggested maybe this would be an interesting movie to make if it could ever be made, is because it's not just about a success of a director, it's actually about the failure of a director.
Yep.
So it's that kind of vulnerability is in a way what gets you in contact with reality.
Yeah. And look, I've said before, like, yeah, like for example, at my church, I lead a monthly grief support group. And it's kind of it's become one of the highlights of my month because the one thing when the parameters are set, we're here to talk about our loss. The thing that we're here to talk about the biggest hole in our existence. And there is no ability to be fake in a room like that. It just can't happen. And if it does happen, it's such a kind of it's such an aberration. Like it actually makes everybody feel really uncomfortable. If somebody hasn't been to the group before and they start saying things like, "Yeah, so I lost my husband 6 months ago, and I'm just trying to stay positive," and like all that. Like every once in a while, somebody will kind of sound like that, and you just kind of like start seeing the looks of the people in the room, like, "Mm-mm, that's not what we're doing here. You do that out there. That's what the world expects. When the world walks up to you, they want to know how you're doing. They don't want to know how you're doing. They don't want to know that like the only thing you ever think about is how you don't have that person in your world anymore. They want you to say something like, I'm getting along. Okay. Oh, good. Thanks. Good to see it. But it's like in the grief group, we're not going to do that. that doesn't happen, right? But in pretty much every other walk of life, it's so many layers of phoniness. And we know it when you see it, like what an incredible blessing it is when something weird happens, or like when somebody does have a plan. I guess Mihaw's plan wasn't quite the right one, but like for that audience, but like how when somebody has a special ability to kind of unlock in other people, whether it's just by their own lack of pretension, or, I know like parents who have disabled children have said that like this, like one of the most incredible unexpected blessings to them is that like if they have a child with Down syndrome, it's like they live with a person in their life who doesn't play that game at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
So then their whole existence changes, right? Um,
And also, they don't have some like, so many parents today who want to, say, well, okay, all the successes of their children. And then when
mhm,
you really get into it, it's like, well, wait a minute here. But if you do have a child who is disabled, it's there's also kind of like, there I think it makes people completely humble. It's like one of the best things. I have one of my cousins, Ian, is the glue of my mom's side of the family. That Ian is the greatest blessing. Because he's the most childlike, and he's not playing any games. I remember like when Ian first met my wife, Ian always has this question, like he always asks you, "How'd you get here? How'd you get here?" And like he'll just repeat it. And then he'll come back and he'll ask you that again. And but there's nothing like he never tries like he doesn't size you up. He's not playing anybody else's game.
mhm,
And in a way that because like I think in some ways a lot of our families we're all in kind of somewhat competition with each other and we're trying to kind of like outdo each other and competitive, you know what I mean? The successes of somebody, do we really want to, celebrate it too much because they might just look a little bit better than us?
mhm.
But
Yeah.
that doesn't go on at all with my cousin. But
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. That's so fascinating. And I mean, just I couldn't help but think about the scene in the movie where you mentioned before kind of just the inevitability of these like conversations that then even if you feel like you are briefly having a connection with a person, when it comes around to the inevitable question of what do you do, or like it's like we can't help ourselves but downshift into let's talk details or information or something like that. And that scene where Wally talks about how when he was a Latin teacher, whenever it would come up that he was a teacher, it was like a medieval portcullis slammed shut between him and his conversation partner. Like, oh my gosh, a teacher! Like, what? Nice talking to you, dude. Like, what do I have? What do I possibly have to gain from talking to some little teacher, right? I mean, or some little person who
secretary.
works in a church, or some little person who, whatever, a secretary, right? I mean, goodness, right? Um, but that's the way it is. That is the way the world is. It's just sad.
It's interesting, but I think Andre's journey, like with groups of people who are totally kind of outside of that is just quite interesting because he talks about, I mean, this is in the context of the laughter, but like, the Tibetans would look at us like we're completely insane. And
Yeah.
the Africans would maybe penetrate us with their spears. They think that we're just like abnormal. And then, I mean, it's funny because in the scene, he actually laughs out loud like a crazy man. And then
Yeah.
finally, that's the waiter comes by and says, are you okay? I mean, is everything okay?
Do you
Uh,
notice, by the way, how judgmental the waiter seems throughout the movie, especially of Wally? Like,
yes.
especially of Wally.
At
Like,
the
he's
end, when Andre pays, it's just the
yes.
look.
Yeah, he kind of looks down like, yeah, I see what's going on here, dude. You're getting yourself a nice free dinner, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Because I mean, even in a fancy restaurant, I mean, Wallace Shawn is, presumably a very smart guy, like has went to college, he writes plays or whatever, but there he is sitting in a restaurant being judged by the waiter at a fancy restaurant, right? Like every ecosystem sort of has its own life, right? And its own every kind of there's a hierarchy everywhere. And I suppose like maybe that's a way to flag this thing that I don't think Andre has quite gotten there, right? Like he's not like rushing out to go become a Catholic or something like that. But I do think like with this idea of the creative minorities and of like really coming to understand human connection in a different way. I do think that he really has come to understand that there is a possibility of human connection,
Yeah.
even if it's rare, and even if the times in between create, are so rare that they create a sort of despair. Um, that they are possible, and they really are completely outside the categories of human relations as the world of diversion, the dream world prescribes them. And I couldn't help but think about just like it can become platitudinous, or it can almost become sort of meaningless, because it's so often referred to. But like the idea that the body of Christ, that the members have real need of each other, and
Mhm.
how like Catholic social teaching teaches that, right? That like it is totally unacceptable on like the deep spiritual level. I'm not talking about in kind of the cocktail party conversation level, but it is totally unacceptable on a deep spiritual level that the portcullis would slam shut between two people who are connected to each other, right? Like we are connected, and that's that. It doesn't matter what we do for a living. It doesn't matter, none of these markers matter.
Yeah.
And that I think is what, on some level, all of us really want. But, you know, it's just so the forces working against that are just so incredibly strong. And I think that's just one of those recurring things that comes up over and over again in this conversation between Andre and Wally.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, like with Paul's letter to Onesimus, right? I hope he's like, no longer send him back as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. I mean, it's yes, okay. So the institution still exists, but nevertheless, in a way, you have to look at him completely different, but always with that reference to Christ. I mean, we mentioned Henri de Lubac so much, and his book Catholicism, and that's that kind of the oh, what's the subtitle of Catholicism? But this new way of relating that is grounded.
Human destiny or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but grounded in communion, the kind
Hmm.
of communio that, we're all kind of longing for, and the full dignity. I really do think that this movie, even though it's not explicitly a Christian humanism, there definitely is a humanism throughout. And so you mentioned the creative minorities. I think that, so many people who are thinking about all these themes, would do well to watch this because I almost feel like there's kind of like a program outlined. Not to get like, because he does mention how we could start with almost something like the Peggy thing, where you start in kind of mystique and it becomes politique. It's like all of a sudden the Finhorn becomes a. I was thinking about ourselves. You become like a non-profit or something, and the whole, if you want to say the spirit. It just becomes this banal thing in the end. Um,
Yeah, I think likely, right? Or it becomes a cult, or it becomes something destructive even. I mean, I think that because, and I do think that maybe that highlights something that is not said, but is clear throughout the movie, which is, the reality of the fall and original sin, I think is like very much in the background here. And again, like I don't even know. Look, I mean, I have a kind of almost supernatural view of this movie because I just feel like Wallace Shawn in particular is an atheist, a socialist. I think Andre Gregory is a kind of actually a much more kind of mystical person by nature. Although he has said in interviews, like, I'm not really like that. I'm not really like Andre in the movie. And Wallace Shawn has actually said in interviews that some of the things Andre says are really much more like things I would have said, right? So it's kind of mysterious or whatever. But I do think that like the fall part, but then also this thing that Andre mentions several times, certainly in the context of the reference to Martin Buber, but then again, right at the end, he mentions sacramentality, and the idea that like really, that's what we're all really looking for, is the grounding in stuff of the life of God, which is ultimately what the sacraments are. And and in all of these ways, and I think especially if we're using a paradigm like the one we favor, coming from the likes of Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger and that sort of thing, I am prepared to say to our dear listeners and viewers that I think My Dinner with Andre is the most Catholic movie ever made.
Yeah, and it's a great feast. I mean, it's
Yes.
over,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'll have to think about that. That is right. I do think that because at the end, and maybe we can wrap it up by talking about Wally's, I mean, you only hear his inner monologue and he doesn't say much, but there's a couple things Andre says we need to do, which is, not only to attend to things, but he one of the last things is just like to remember,
Hmm.
to remember. And it's almost in some ways through the memory that the reality you make that contact. So like I'm thinking I was thinking of Pope Benedict's throughout Pope Benedict's writings, you oftentimes find animasis, right? And it's connected to the Eucharist. And it's this, you know, and when Wally is in, sorry, but that remembering, when Wally goes into the taxi, treats himself to a taxi, I guess with the cash he didn't have to spend on the dinner.
Right,
But
right.
then he's passing by all these places that he remembers getting, ice cream soda there, and then he remembers, and in a way, it's like at the very end, the person who was in the most need was Wally himself.
That's right. That's right.
Because you start with Andre. Andre's the one crying on the side,
Hmm.
talking to trees and all that, but it's Wally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was deeply therapeutic to both of them. I think that it was a real, I mean, it was a kind of almost mystical supper in a strange way, which I think Louis Malle, the director, did a great job interjecting the interruptions of the world to kind of remind us that there is no kind of perfect um, companionship, I suppose, right? Or like perfect kind of mystical meal, maybe. I think that that was really effective. But yeah, I just want to like underline what you were just saying by also saying this. The last thing that Andre says is he mentions Heidegger, and then he goes through this litany. He says like, what is a father? What is a mother? Well, like he's basically like kind of like questioning this whole idea of human connection right at the end. But then the very last thing he says is, where is that son? That's the last thing that he says. And then the next thing we see is Wally getting in the taxi, remembering his childhood in New York and all that sort of thing. And there really is, again, even though it isn't thinking about being a son of the Father or being baptized into the communion of the believers in Christ or something like that, there really is this, I really do think, this like deeply sacramental sense at the end of precisely what you just said of remembering, of like, Wally can suddenly see. And he's being kind of nostalgic in a way for his childhood, but at the same
Yeah.
time, he's being himself in a way that really can only be a gift of grace. Like he didn't even want to go to that dinner. And yet he goes away from it in the end like more human and able to like in a sense like evangelize to Debbie about his dinner with Andre, right? I'm
Yeah.
probably reading way too much into it, but that's the beauty of art. We can do that. I mean, that's why these things are made, you
Hmm.
know?
Well, you think, yeah, I know we got to wrap up here, but the relating to the father, I mean, like, because I think he does mention at the very end, like those memories, not just of getting, ice cream soda after school, but going with his dad to different
Hmm.
places.
Hmm.
There's kind of that. I think I was listening to mention Heidegger. I remember at the JP2 Institute, there was a guy who came to talk about fatherlessness as kind of being an ontological thing, like the foundations of your very being without a
Hmm.
father are broken because there's this longing that's in your memory to connect with the Father, and so there's this primordial thing for the cosmos, which like what's his name? I mean, I'm sorry, Wally wants this order in the cosmos. He keeps talking about this order, and everything's kind of predictable, but it's relating to the Father that is in some ways that gives you that beautiful whole. And I'm going off a little bit here, but Wally, I didn't know that Wallace Shawn's dad was the editor of the New Yorker.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So like, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, to relate it back to that as the one who gave him the life of arts and music. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I mean, I like you said in the beginning, Andrew, we kind of sit in Wally's seat. And when the movie began and he's 36, I'm a little bit older than 36, and he begins his life thinking about arts and music, but now all he can think about is money.
Hmm.
Uh, I relate to that. And there's something with money that,
Hmm.
in a way, prevents you from making that mystical like ascent that Andre is making.
Yes.
And, you know,
Yes.
I kind of felt this though little resentment towards Andre throughout the film. Like, oh, here's some kind of fancy aristocrat who can just, jet across the world. And, how many people can do that? And even Wally kind of mentions that. But at the end, he at least can show you that that cigar shop next to the street is actually just as much full of reality and mysticism as anything else.
Yeah. I mean, you have to think that Andre, you already said it, but just to say it again, I mean, Andre benefited. Well, obviously Wally benefited, but I think Andre really did too. Like, I think that he probably, and especially based on Andre Gregory's real experiences, like he probably had told bits of these stories to people in different ways, and who knows what the reception of them might have been like. Maybe by the time he's sitting down with Wally, it was all a bit of a show. It was a bit of a routine that he did. But clearly, I mean, we don't know precisely what kind of encounters he had with other people, but clearly it wasn't just a show by the end. It was something that was transformative for both of them. So, yeah, I know we're running out of time, but gosh, there's some few things that are more enjoyable in this world than talking about something that transformed us, right? And that the power of a great movie or a great book to do that is alive and well. So many of the concerns that Andre articulates in particular are ones that resonate very deeply with me. I do worry sometimes that we're just becoming less and less human all the time, and I hate it, and I want to lash out against it. And those are the moments when I can put on a movie like My Dinner with Andre and feel like a deep boost in my soul of my humanity and my worth before God, my purpose in this world. So I don't know. I'll just end with like a plea to our listeners and viewers to go and watch this movie.
Yeah, well, it's up on YouTube, so everybody, you can go watch that there, and it's not that long. But please, yeah, maybe to make sense of this, go watch the movie, then return to our conversation. But if you're already hearing this, I bet you got through our whole
Yeah,
conversation.
thanks for listening this long if you've never
Yeah.
seen the movie. Thank you.
So, but on that note, check out our content on the website. We're going to be picking things back up. Excited for the new year. A lot of things in store for the Spe Salvi Institute, and we'll have more announcements ahead. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check us out on the various audio versions of this conversation, and share this with your friends. And as we always say, live in hope.